is officially spooky season. And you know what's more scary than spooky season? Horror novels. And you know what's even spookier than that? Critiquing those horror novels. Because the only thing scarier than horror and creepy clowns and haunted houses is revision. I have definitely made that joke before. Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie, and today we're doing a spooky edition of First Page Critiques. This is a series in which I take the first page of books and dissect them and critique them in the hope of shedding some light on what makes a good first page or what makes a bad first page, while also sharing my college education and keeping myself from being rusty and, you know, not losing my critical analysis skills, because you need those to live. And today, as you guessed, we're doing spooky season, which means we're gonna be doing horror novels. Today I chose a classic horror, a popular horror, a children's horror, and a current horror. How many times can I say horror in one video? Drinking game unlocked? No, because the real monster is alcohol poisoning. Drink responsibly, kids. Also, I'm wearing my cute little skeletons today. I've worn these in like every spooky video. We're gonna continue to wear them because I love these horns. Also, got my friend Mr. Skellington and Edgar Allan Poe over there. So most of this is already staples of my usual everyday content, but it's perfect for spooky season too. If you don't know me, I have a degree in creative writing and literature, and I like to make these videos to use my skills that I learned in college, while also maybe passing on some helpful information to you, maybe giving you insight into how to perhaps fix your own first page if anything like this resonates with you in your writing journey. And as always, writing and art is subjective, so if you disagree with any of my opinions, you are free to do that. You can have a lovely conversation down in the comments below if you would like. So without further ado, let's begin, and let's start with a classic horror. And I chose for this The Haunting of Hill House by Shelley Jackson. Nope, I chose The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. The Haunting of Hill House is a novel from 1959, and it is classed as a gothic horror novel, written by American author Shirley Jackson. It was a finalist for the National Book Award and is considered one of the best literary ghost stories of the 20th century. It has been the basis of a Netflix series, which is incredibly popular, at least among my friends, and is of course on my watch list for this spooky season. So we begin the book with what I like to call a theme stated, which is a great way to start a book, and oftentimes a lot of classic literature starts with a theme stated. It says, no live organism can continue for long to exist. Ooh, gotta break out my reading glasses for this. The spookiest thing, my failing eyesight. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed, by some, to dream. This is a statement of fact, but then we go on to have a little twist. I like to talk about twists within narrative conversation about how, you know, you're told one thing and then you immediately revert back on it to create this kind of interest, this intrigue in the reader. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against the hills, holding a darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might for 80 more. Immediately, I love how we're brought into the world and into the house that is, I assume, going to be the backdrop for the rest of the novel. And also, hopefully, become a character within the novel. So we have this concept of a haunted house, which is not sane and therefore does not dream. And that's an interesting concept to me, especially because when you like conjoin the sentence before with this sentence, the comparison of reality and being sane, dreaming and not, almost by saying that the house is not sane, we're also saying that it's not asleep, which is a cool concept. I think really nice when you talk about haunted houses and like how, you know, a house is an inanimate object and yet it holds so much in it, and like what really constitutes a haunted house. And then we get a description of the house showing that it isn't decrepit. I specifically love the line, whatever walked there walked alone. A little spine tingling for you. And then we're introduced to our first main character, Dr. John Montague, which is a fun name. I love Montague as a last name. I wonder if we're going to be getting a Shakespeare connection, which Shakespeare is right there up on my shelves, and also that is Shakespeare, and these are all my Shakespeare novels, so I'm a Shakespeare girly. Although I did look up what Montague actually meant, because oftentimes, you know, names have certain meanings, and it actually means pointed hill, which is pretty clever. Point to you, Shirley Jackson. And we're introduced to the doctor and what he is a doctor in, but he has a secret passion and analysis of supernatural manifestations. We're given a good insight into his character in these first paragraphs. He knows his investigations are unscientific, but he hopes his authority of academia will pay off. Same. It had cost him a good deal in money and pride, since he was not a begging man, to rent Hill House for 3 months. But he expected absolutely to be compensated for his pains by the sensation following upon the— I'm just gonna pause here, because these sentences are really long. This is definitely a staple of older literature, and this book specifically falls within the American contemporary period. After World War II, literature began to shift rapidly from modernism to, you guessed it, postmodernism, which is one of my personal favorite periods to talk about. And I'm hopefully not going to get off on a tangent, but the main objective of postmodernism literature is to break away from conventional traditions with new literary devices, form, genre, style, etc. And while longer sentence style is typically an older style, it does seem to fit within this POV because it does lean more academic, which makes sense because our main character is a doctor of philosophy. And if you've met anyone with a philosophy degree, you will know they're quite long-winded and fairly verbose. Anyway, to get back to the text and not go off on an analysis of postmodernism, we're then given this information about what his goal is: to publish his findings on the cause and effects of psychic disturbances in a house commonly known as haunted. We're given a timeline of his feelings, from doubt, then hopeful, then indefatigable. Don't know how to say that word. That's a big one for Elmo, which means tirelessly persisting, stubborn, essentially. So in this first page, we're given a statement, a theme of what Hill House is, and then we're told why we're going to be there. Why should we care about this house that has stood for 80 years and probably will stand for 80 more? Why is this the backdrop of the setting? And that's because of Dr. Montague. We see why he's going to study this house, because he's interested on the effects of a haunted place on the psyche. We are not immediately introduced to any horror or anything particularly scary, except for maybe a long sentence or two. That might be the true horror in these words. I think we can always take and learn lessons even from literature that is almost 70 years old. I find myself personally intrigued more about this house that sits among the hills and isn't sane and doesn't dream. It raises questions, but it also gives this overlook onto a character's personality and ultimately gives us some insight in how they ended up in this scenario, which is pretty important when you're setting up the beginning of a novel, particularly one that relies on horror elements and haunted elements. I feel like you have to ground us in reality so when you bring in the unreal, it feels more natural and like you actually make sense of it. Well done, Shirley Jackson. You've been dead for a very long time, but I'm very intrigued in your novel. Next, we're going to move on to our popular horror book. And this man has published many novels, has had many of his works adapted, and while I've never read this book, I love the movies to death. They're some of my comfort movies, which I know is going to sound weird, but that's me. And that is It by Stephen King. For some background, it was published in 1986 and was King's 22nd novel. If you didn't know, it is famously extremely long. It's 1,138 pages, which is a lot, but it is several timelines, several POVs, and all revolves around a killer clown demonic entity thing. So how else would you start a 1,000-page book except for with a flood? It's almost biblical, which I imagine was probably the purpose. So yes, we start in 1957, which is ironically 2 years before the publishing of The Haunting of Hill House. And the first line reads, "The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain." This is the image that starts it all. It is very innocuous in its beginning, very childlike, which is very core to the themes of this book, which have to do with coming of age and sex and love and drama and all the things of teenagehood and like naivety and innocence and such. Also, Pennywise very famously eats children, if you weren't aware, spoiler alert. Which I also find it interesting that we do have the use of the pronoun I, as if there is an I person telling this story. I don't know if that continues throughout the novel. I'm not sure what to make of it, to be quite honest. It is interesting because, as far as I can tell, the book itself is not in first person for most part. It's just described as if it's from a first person overview, which is a choice, Mr. King. Then we have a description of where the boat is going, which I find is fairly standard. We personify the boat, call it brave as it goes through treacherous whirlpools, and continues to a traffic light. Everything is dark this afternoon. It's the fall, and it's been raining for a long time, about a week. I'm surprised this isn't set in Pennsylvania. Rains all the fucking time here. Then we get Georgie. Ah, poor Georgie. Running in his iconic yellow slicker. We're treated to this image of the rain slackening, finally, and tapped on the yellow hood of the boy's slicker, sounding to his ears like rain on a shed roof, a comfortable, almost cozy sound. Already we're getting a competing set of vibes, a kind of juxtaposition that is a little bit of cognitive dissonance, perhaps, for the reader. Dark, the street is empty, it's raining, flooding almost, and then we have this cozy Georgie in his yellow slicker and the cozy sound of rain on the coat, and we learn that he's 6 years old. A child, a baby, if you will. Then we're introduced to his brother, William, known to most of the kids at Derry Elementary School, and even to the teachers who would have never used the nickname to his face, as Stuttering Bill was at home hacking out the last of a nasty case of influenza. Bill is one of our main characters throughout the rest of the story, and this discussion of him being ill is important when it comes to the guilt that he feels surrounding Georgie and Georgie's inevitable death, and that is an important part of his arc. We're told in a very long-winded way that Bill is 10, and part of me is like, okay, did we need to know right now that it takes 8 months for all of this to go down, and do we need to reiterate that it's been 28 years? And do we need to reiterate that it's 28 years until the final showdown? I don't think so. I think in terms of a chapter opener, it's good. I mean, I like this as an opening image, already showing the theme and juxtaposition of scary versus childlike. I do think it'd be bold to open with a Pennywise moment, which is the only downside to doing one-page critiques as opposed to like a first chapter. It's just this video would get way too long if I did that. But my usual problem with Stephen King is that he's very wordy, which is, I know, ironic and slightly hypocritical coming from me. But I do feel like there's a fair amount of fluff surrounding the meat. I mean, do we need to know that the boat is going down Witcham Street and the intersection of Witcham and Jackson? We're told that the slicker is yellow twice, that it's the autumn of 1957 twice, that the terror is happening for 28 years, etc. I just don't feel like this information needs to be said multiple times over the course of like a page and a half. Feels like repetition for the sake of repetition, and that isn't my favorite. And you know what? Maybe that explains why it's over 1,000 pages. I'm very sad we didn't get any Pennywise in this first page. That would be kind of wild, but you know, I expect nothing less from Stephen King. Although I do notice with Stephen King novels, they tend to start a little bit slowly. And I don't know, maybe this is controversial, but I might recommend watching the new movies instead. Next, we're gonna move on to a children's horror, and who better to choose than R.L. Stine. And if you're looking for a spooky readathon, man, do I have the thing for you. I'd like to shout out the Nostalgia Train Book Club run by Writing Violet. I'll leave links to her channel down below as well as the announcement for this STINE-O-WEEN readathon where they're going to be reading all things R.L. Stine for the month of October. So if you're looking to read some more R.L. Stine related things, you can go check them out. And I also recommend going and checking out the Nostalgia Train Book Club anyway. I really love them. Back to R.L. Stine, in case you didn't know, he's written hundreds of Goosebumps novels, which I read as a child, so like these are the ones that like scared the shit out of me when I was a kid and made me love horror things. I also had a DS game called Goosebumps Horrorland. Does anyone remember that, or is it just me? Or is that just a weird fever dream? I was obsessed with that game. The book that I selected was Night of the Living Dummy, because this is the one that scared me the most as a kid, and I remember it pretty well. I think my mom actually read it to me, or maybe my brother did, because he had all of the Goosebumps books. He was obsessed with them just like I was. This book was published in 1993 and was the 7th Goosebumps book to be released. And it begins with twin sisters acting like sisters. Lindy is reading a book and Chris is trying to get her attention by blowing big bubbles of bubblegum. And what I like the most about the beginning is that we're introduced to a pretty realistic sibling dynamic. Nice one, Lindy said without much enthusiasm. With a sudden move, she poked the bubble and it popped. Then Chris angrily grabbed Lindy's paperback and slammed it shut. Whoops, lost your place. She knew her sister hated to lose her place in a book. Chris then says that it was the biggest bubble she ever blew, and Lindy says she's blown bigger stuff than that with a superior sneer. Again, introduces us to this dynamic between the two girls, this push and pull with their competitiveness, which I think this actually does end up coming to play as well, because if I remember correctly, one of the twins is jealous of the other one for finding the dummy Slappy, which is the creepy one on the cover, and then they get into like a fight about the dummy because one of them is getting more attention than the other. And so at the beginning of this novel, on this first page, we're shown this conflict that will then ripple out and affect the rest of the plot of the novel. And in children's books, you really do kind of have to start fast because kids have a short attention span and you only have so much time. Like, we don't have 1,000 pages of Stephen King to introduce Slappy the dummy and these twins' interactions, you know? It shows a realistic look at how these kids are, but also shows how they're fighting over something stupid now and how that will escalate throughout the rest of the novel and create the overall conflict. Then the last thing I would like to note is the description of the girls. So the rest of like the first or second page is a description of what the girls look like, and it says both blushed easily, large pink circles forming on their pale cheeks. And this specifically draws to mind how dolls are painted with like circles on their cheeks to like show blush. And this is such a fun description, I think very apt, considering this whole book revolves around a ventriloquist dummy, which is essentially like a type of doll. So it's a good foreshadowing to that. Overall, I really like this page. It's right into the character dynamics, which is a good way to open up a book, and foreshadows a future conflict, which I think both of these things are important right really early in not just like a horror novel, but in a novel in general, and especially in a children's novel where there are less pages for you to actually establish things. Gotta start snappy. And finally, last but not least, hello. So sorry to interrupt, but unfortunately, after filming this portion of my first page critiqued, I looked up the book that I had chosen to see if I wanted to continue reading it, and unfortunately it turns out that this book is full of fascist dog whistles, transphobia, fat phobia, and a bunch of other things that I just don't condone on my channel. So I won't be giving it this space here today. Apologies for this, meaning that first page critique will be cut short, but it turns out the true horror is shitty people. And that is our horror first page critique video, done and dusted. I hope you did enjoy. Let me know what your favorite horror book opening is, and if there's any that like start immediately with horror and not just like, you know, unsettling vibes or like descriptions of character and conflict and stuff. And if you did enjoy this video, make sure to like it down below. It tells me that you enjoy this type of content, and I will continue to make first page critiques. Tell me what genre or author you would like me to tackle next in my next installment of this. Make sure to subscribe if you never want to miss another one of my videos or my rambling face, and I will see you in the next one.